Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to those of you here in the room with us, as well as those watching on GrassRoots television. I'm John Bennett, co-chair of the Aspen Institute's Community Forum on Transportation and Mobility. I'm delighted you can join us for this third event in a series of public talks on the future of transportation and mobility in the Upper Roaring Fork Valley. I especially want to thank our community sponsors and partners in this initiative, the City of Aspen, the Pitkin County, and the Town of Snowmass Village. Before my co-chair, Bill Kane, introduces our special guest tonight, I want to give you a little background on the Community Forum. It actually dates back to 1995, in the days when I was mayor of Aspen. Back then, the Aspen Institute convened a group of community leaders to identify emerging issues and trends that had the potential to affect the long-term economic, social, and environmental well-being of our valley, and to recommend policies and solutions to address those emerging issues. The Institute hosted task forces on healthcare, communications and technology, affordable housing, the Pitkin County Home Rule Charter, youth engagement, economics, and economic sustainability. It also sponsored an initiative to improve election campaign civility, something we could use in another capital across this land. Fast forward to 2016, the Institute was asked by a number of citizens and officials to convene a forum to look at new ways of approaching our transportation issues. After discussion with community members, the Aspen Institute offered to host a series of public talks featuring world-class experts in traffic, transportation, and mobility. In tandem with these public talks, the Community Forum would also convene a task force made up of community members with diverse viewpoints who would meet with these experts to assess how we as a community could apply some of their ideas here in this valley. The overall objective of the task force is to develop a transportation mobility vision for where the Upper Valley should be in 20 years, with a particular focus on our quality of life, environmental sustainability, air quality, and social equity. This work focuses on high-level visionary and policy-oriented discussions. Task force members will develop ideas that will be presented to the community and elected officials at the end of the task force process, which will wrap up in the next few months. The first in this series of talks was given by Jim Charlier. Hopefully many of you heard it. If not, you can watch it on the Institute's website. He discussed the influence of economics, demographics, settlement patterns, technology, and behavior changes on transportation systems and mobility. In March, the forum hosted Ann Bowers and Chris Breland of Fair and Piers in Denver and Seattle, respectively. Bowers and Breland spoke to the community about travel demand management, new ride-sharing technologies, mode options, and other emerging transportation innovations. Inspired by these speakers, the task force is working on a values-based mechanism for evaluating mobility solutions that elected officials in the community can use when considering future transportation decisions. This values matrix will allow elected officials and the community to view transportation and mobility options through the lens of core issues important to the community at large. Tonight we will hear from Tony Dutzik, and on June 6th, we'll feature Greg Rux of the Rocky Mountain Institute as our final speaker in this series. That event will take place at the Wheeler Opera House at 5:30 p.m. on the 6th. I hope you can join us. With that, I will turn this program over to Bill Kane. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Appreciate that. I have the distinct honor of introducing Tony Dutzik. And John kind of recapped the speakers that we've had. The spirit of this exercise was to bring folks from not only different geographic sort of bases around the country, but bring people from different disciplines and with different perspectives. Tony's with the Frontier Group located in Boston, and they're a public policy research group. They don't limit their focus to transportation, but they have a wonderful sort of broad base and an interdisciplinary way of evaluating public policy. They're currently working on a mechanism for evaluating public infrastructure, efficiency of public infrastructure investments, and it's pretty neat. So if you look at the mission for the Frontier Group and Tony's work, Their mission is to find a cleaner, healthier, and more democratic America, which is kind of a wonderful way to proceed. So in our search for speakers, we wanted to, there was almost a perfect fit when we looked at the Frontier Group and Tony's background, because their focus is on creative and flexible mobility. And we just thought it was a perfect fit for us to kind of get the creative juices going. Tony's an accomplished author and has published extensively. His work can be found in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, NPR, the Aspen Times, Aspen Daily News. I don't think so. Post-Independent. But with that, I think John's covered the speakers we've had. With that, I'd be pleased to introduce Tony and get the creative wheels going tonight. So come on up, Tony. Thank you very much.
All right, good evening. All right, it's great to be with you tonight. It's been a long time since I've been back in Aspen. The last time I was here was actually in the late 90s, and being here, I got in last night and I've had a little bit of chance to walk around town and go for a run on the Rio Grande Trail, and just reminded of what a special place it is that you all have the opportunity to enjoy every day. So pleased and honored to have the opportunity to talk with you all tonight. Again, my name is Tony Dutzik, and I work for an organization called the Frontier Group. This is our mission, which has already been described. And I am based in Boston, Massachusetts, so happy to have the chance to come out here tonight. The organization that I work with, we are a public policy think tank. So what we do is we research ideas on a variety of different public policy topics, and then we work to communicate what we have learned and understand about them to the public, decision makers, and others. Our organization, we actually have an office in Denver with a couple of staff, so we have roots in Colorado, and we are part of a larger network of organizations called the Public Interest Network, which also has a deep history and connection with Colorado. Among our member organizations are Environment Colorado, COPERG, and Snow Riders International. So very excited to be here and to deepen that connection tonight. I'm here tonight to talk with you about what we call innovative mobility, and that is a wave of new technological tools and transportation services that are in the process of revolutionizing how we move people and goods, both in the United States and around the world. For the last 5 years or so, we have been tracking this mobility revolution and making the case that these tools, when combined, create an opportunity to rethink the way that our transportation system works and to challenge what has for a long time been the dominant model of mobility in the United States, which is our dependence on personal cars. And tonight I want to take you on a quick tour of this emerging and rapidly changing world. And by the end of our presentation, I'm hoping that I can give you a little bit of a flavor of what that world looks like and where we might be going, to let you know how some of these innovations are actually being applied in places around the country and in a couple of cases around the world, and also to help you consider how they may or may not be part of your future here in Aspen and the Roaring Fork Valley. One of the things that I've noticed in my last couple of days here is that some of the things that I talk about in this presentation are things that you're already doing. So I've gotten to use the bike share system in town here and notice that you have a car sharing system and seen the work that you've done around bus rapid transit. So you all are doing things here that cities that are 10 times your size are still struggling to figure out how to get off the ground. So there's a really good base of a really good foundation, I think, to build off of in this community, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of those options as we proceed. So a little over a century ago, I imagine that people around the country were having a similar conversation to the kind of conversations that we're having now, because the United States was about to launch into the last mobility revolution that we had, which was the introduction of the automobile. This is Henry Ford, and in 1908, he introduced the Model T, which brought personal mobility within the financial reach of the majority of American households. So this was really potentially transformative. And almost from the time that this started to happen, people started to imagine the ways in which the automobile could change society, the ways that we could rebuild the opportunities that it created for us to address issues related to housing, to congestion in our cities, to quality of life. And one of those early and very influential visioning exercises I want to share with you a little bit of here. And it took place at the 1939 World's Fair. We can start the video.
American cities have fundamentally altered how they built themselves over the last 60 years. And to me, the place that it really started was the 1939 World's Fair. At what was the most successful World's Fair in history, the most successful exhibit was one called Futurama.
To help us get a glimpse into the future of this unfinished world of ours, there has been created for the New York World's Fair a thought-provoking exhibit of the developments ahead of us. A vivid tribute to the American scheme of living. Come, let's travel into the future. What will we see?
Futurama portrayed the future of the city in that distant year 1960.
The world we are now seeing is a vision, an artistic conception which may undergo many changes as it develops into the great realities of tomorrow.
And it portrayed a city that was car-driven, lots of open spaces. You could live in the country and drive to your job downtown, and you'd have the best of two worlds.
Over space, man has begun to win victory.
Suburban splendor and urban excitement. Not coincidentally, Futurama was sponsored by General Motors, and they were promoting what we wanted. And it's my sense that 1939, just before the war, the clouds are looming over Europe. We go off to war, and we have this image that's mulling in our minds, and we come back and we implement Futurama.
15 million.
Okay. So I have a little hobby of finding futuristic videos like this. You can find a bunch of them in YouTube from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And when you watch those videos, there's a few words that keep coming up over and over again. And those words include things like freedom, speed, safety, new, and modern. And those were the values that were driving the way in which a lot of places in the United States saw the accommodation of the automobile and the way that it would change their cities and their surroundings. And it was those values that informed public policy, including the creation of the interstate highway network, the way that we design our cities and towns. Everything flowed from those values that people believed to be important. However, not everybody made the same decisions. So there were cities in the United States, towns in the United States, and certainly around the world that opted not to rip out their rail lines and subway lines and streetcar lines, that opted to preserve their walkable town centers, as you've done here in Aspen, and that opted to create spaces where people could walk and bike and not necessarily have to be dependent on the car. And the reason that I mention all this as an introduction to our topic tonight is because if we're headed into a mobility revolution, and I think that we are, we need to recognize that the decisions that we make, more than about public policy and the way that we shape our communities and our values, are more important than the technology itself in determining the outcome. And those decisions, the public policies, are going to be influenced by our values. So this process through the Aspen Community Forum is working to identify and lift up core values that you want to use in evaluating these technologies and other steps that you might want to use to improve transportation in your city. And that's a really important and valuable and worthwhile thing to be doing. But in addition to identifying our values, we also need to know what's in our toolbox. So what are the materials that we have to work with in building the kind of transportation system and the kind of communities that we want to build? And What's exciting about this moment in transportation is that the number and variety of potential tools that we have in our toolbox is exploding. Over the last 10 or 15 years, both the advances in information technology, in shared mobility, and soon in automated vehicles give us many different options for providing transportation to people in a way that is equitable, that is sustainable, and that supports our community quality of life, if we make the right decisions and have those decisions be informed by our values. So I want to spend some time tonight just walking through what that landscape looks like. And again, some of these are going to be things that are familiar to you. I hope that some of them are things that will be a little bit new and surprising. But when we talk in our work about innovative mobility, what we mean are this set of things: advances in information technology, in what we call shared mobility, and in automated vehicles. Now, information technology helps people to better understand and access their transportation options. Let me give you an example. So a few years ago, if I wanted to take the bus in my neighborhood, and this is my bus line in Boston, I would have had to look at something like this. This is a timetable. It's printed in teeny tiny print, and it would tell me when the bus was supposed to show up at my location and where it would get me. If the bus didn't show up on time, if I didn't have this piece of paper or I hadn't memorized the schedule, if I didn't know how to read it, if the bus didn't show up on time, or if I showed up at the stop without exact change, I was in a world of trouble. Today, we access this information, or we can access this information through our smartphones. This is Google Maps, which is telling me on this very same trip when the bus is, what my options are, so it gives me more than one option for getting from point A to point B, when they're going to show up. Because they have real-time data, they will tell me whether they are running on time or running late. And increasingly, we're finding that transit agencies are moving toward that making payment happen online. So this is part of the MBTA's payment app for its commuter rail service. Our local transit agency was the first in the country to allow for mobile payment for commuter rail. And so what this does is that it reduces many of the barriers that people feel. And I'm sure that you've seen some of this as you've rolled out these technologies and ideas here in the Roaring Fork Valley, that it reduces some of the barriers to people making a sustainable transportation choice. Now, that's not the only way that information technology can help. How many people here, I'm just curious, in the audience have a Fitbit or another kind of fitness tracker? A few? Okay. How many of you made your 10,000 steps today? All right, congratulations. That feels really good when you do that. No, you're, okay. That makes you feel really good when you do that and feel accomplished, that you have a goal that's been set and that you reach it. And transit agencies and cities are experimenting with ways to use smartphone apps and games to encourage people to undertake behaviors that are beneficial for themselves or beneficial for the system as a whole, and sometimes beneficial for the environment. So let me give you a couple of examples. Recently in San Francisco, the Bay Area Rapid Transit Authority, which runs the large-scale rail transit network in the Bay Area, had a contest. And over a 6-month period of time, you could sign up for this contest. And their problem was that too many people were riding the trains during the rush hour in the morning. The trains were overcrowded. They wanted to find ways to encourage people to leave for work a little earlier. So they ran a contest. You could sign up for this. And every time that you swiped your card as you went into the subway, you got a certain number of points toward the contest. And if you left earlier, you got more points than if you left during the morning rush hour. And at the end of the contest, you were entered into a drawing, and the more points that you had, the greater a chance that you had of winning a prize. And eventually, you know, the winner won a prize. During that trial, about 250 people actually switched their commuting times from the main portion of the morning to earlier in the day. And that's not a lot, but it is an indication of the kinds of things that can happen on some scale through these kinds of interventions. Now, the one that I am most familiar with is that we had a contest in Boston called Boston's Safest Driver, which, if you've ever driven in Boston, is a really low bar. You don't have to do much to be Boston's safest driver. However, What this contest did was it was based on a smartphone app. And if you signed up for this contest and it was entirely voluntary and downloaded the app would essentially measure how well you drove. It would tell you if you were, it would calculate if you were speeding. It would say whether or not you were braking too fast or accelerating too fast. It would take all these behaviors into account. And there was a public leaderboard that showed where you stood relative to others. And at the end of the contest, the winner got a $2,000 cash prize and a photo op with the mayor. And again, these are things that people are just starting to try out. And I can tell you honestly that this particular contest has not eliminated unsafe drivers from the streets of Boston, but they are opportunities to engage with the public and to find nudges for behavior that are delivered in a little bit of a different way. Now, information technology also enables the explosion of what we call shared mobility. And to define shared mobility really simply, it's mobility services where people share rides, share vehicles, or both. Now, there's nothing new about shared mobility. A bus is a shared mobility system. A taxi is a shared mobility system. And we've been sharing rides and sharing vehicles as long as there have been rides and vehicles to share. But what information technology does is that it creates new opportunities for people to share rides and share vehicles who might not otherwise have had the opportunity to do so because the transaction costs of getting those people together would otherwise have been so high. I mean, if you think about trying to share a ride with someone to some place prior to the smartphone era, you would have had to call them up, you'd have had to maybe call up several people. It would have been very logistically difficult. So information technology creates opportunities for people to get together to share things that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to share. Now, car sharing is the first of these forms, and car sharing is essentially when a group of people share vehicles in a fleet that they drive themselves. And there are many different forms of it. The most common form, and the one that's been around in the United States the longest, is what we call round-trip car sharing. So you pick up a car at one parking spot, you drive it to pick up groceries or to go for a day in the country, and then you return it to the same spot at the end. I believe that Aspen's Car to Go is an example of round-trip car sharing. There's also one-way car sharing, where you pick up a car in one place and you drop it off somewhere else. And these are great for quick hops around town. They're great if you miss the bus or you need to get to a meeting in a hurry. They're really expensive if you want to do the things that you would do with round-trip car sharing, such as spend a lot of time going shopping or going for a trip in the country. Car to Go, with the number 2, is the global leader in this kind of one-way car sharing service, and I believe that they're present in Denver. Peer-to-peer car sharing is when the car that you share actually belongs to your neighbor. And there are a couple of services that enable people to put up their own cars to be shared and to share other people's cars, kind of like a car version of Airbnb. And this kind of service is actually really useful in places that don't have the density of demand to support a fleet of dedicated cars. So if you're in a more suburban or a more rural area, it might not make sense to put a shared vehicle out there that's only going to be used every once in a while, but your neighbor might want to put their car up to be used periodically by their neighbors and friends when they need it. And then lastly, there's a new variant that's come out in the last couple of years, which is electric car sharing. And this is where you have a car that is parked at an electric charging station, you pick it up and you can return it either to that charging station or a charging station across town. There's one of these systems in Indianapolis, and they just started one they are starting one in Los Angeles that's actually targeted at low-income communities. And what's interesting about this service is that it gets a lot of electric vehicle charging infrastructure onto city streets. And you can actually, if you own an electric vehicle and you don't belong to this service, you can actually sign up as a charging member for this service and charge your own private EV at these charging stations. If you can do car sharing, you can do bike sharing. You all here are familiar with this through the WeCycle program. Station-based bike sharing has been around since about 2010 in the United States. There's a newer form that has really just begun in the last couple of years called free-floating bike sharing, where all of the equipment that you need to sign out the bike and to determine its location is actually on the bike itself. So you can chain it up anywhere in the city and you can use a GPS to find out where it's gone. Now, there's a lot of attention in innovative mobility circles to ride sharing. And what people usually mean when they say ride sharing are things like Lyft and Uber. That, in my book, is not real ride sharing. Real ride sharing is when two people who are going to the same place, who would otherwise have driven themselves, decide to travel together. And again, this kind of ride sharing is nothing new. It used to be that if you did this kind of ride sharing with somebody that you knew, it was called a carpool. And if you did it with somebody that you didn't know, it was called hitchhiking. And all of these different variants of ride sharing have information technology services that have attempted or are attempting to make them happen more easily. So in Europe, and I realize that some of these slides are pretty hard to see, and this one especially, in the top left corner. In Europe, there's a service called BlaBlaCar. And BlaBlaCar exists in 22 countries, and it has 40 million members in Europe. And BlaBlaCar is an intercity ride-sharing service. If you know someone, it doesn't work if you're going across town, but it does work if you were going from Denver to Aspen, or if you were going from one city to another city across a longer distance. And with BlaBlaCar, you can sign up as a member, and you can see the rides of people who were making that trip anyway, and offer to join in on their car ride with picking up some of their expenses. Not only do you get to see where they're going, but you also can choose your ride based on the characteristics of the trip. So there's an indicator where the drivers indicate whether they are the chatty type who like to talk a lot, or whether they're quiet. And they also indicate whether they like to play music in the car, or whether they like to have a quiet ride. So if you want to have a chatty, music-filled ride, you can choose that. If you want to have something else, you can choose that. BlaBlaCar does not exist in the United States. And the reason that BlaBlaCar does not exist in the United States, and that other services like it are hard to get going in the US, is because in Europe, gas is really expensive, and for longer distance roads, you often have to pay a toll. So there's an economic incentive for people to share rides through a system like this in Europe that does not exist here. So that's important to remember. Folks are also working to make this happen for carpooling for shorter trips as well. So the service Waze, W-A-Z-E, which is a wayfinding and traffic service for drivers, now has launched in a few cities a carpool app where a lot of people use this app to figure out the best way to get to and from wherever they're going. And now through this app, you can find other Waze users to then share a trip with and to carpool. And again, this is just getting going. There are other services like this. It's been kind of hard to get these services off the ground in a lot of ways for partly the reasons that I just talked about. Uber and Lyft also have some services that do a little bit of ride sharing where you can actually offer to opt to share your Lyft or Uber ride with another passenger, and you can save money for yourselves. There are a lot of names for what to call Lyft and Uber. So some people call them ride sharing, which I think is not the best term. Some people call them ride sourcing, as we do here. There's ride hailing. Some people call them transportation network companies, which yields the really horrible acronym of TNCs. But whatever you call them, these services basically enable you on your cell phone to hail and pay for a ride with a private driver who is not necessarily a full-time professional. Many of these same principles also carry over to taxis, so taxi services have created similar services to this as well. And it's been a rapidly emerging option in a lot of different cities. I saw recently that there are now, ride sourcing is now available in about 300 cities across the country. So there are places in the United States that never had adequate taxi service that now have access to on-demand mobility through these services. And then lastly, there's something called microtransit, which is transit-like service that's provided in smaller vehicles like this van. The service Chariot in San Francisco does this in vehicles that look like this, and what they do is that they crowdsource shuttle routes, essentially. If you decide that I would like to have a chariot route that goes from where I live to where I work, you can put it up online. And if enough other people join in with you to have that route, there's a good chance that Chariot is going to launch that route. Right now, they have 24 routes in San Francisco, which is akin in size to some small city transit agencies. So it's been growing fairly quickly, and they were just bought out by Ford Motor Company and are planning to expand in a number of other cities. There have been some other variations of this. In my city of Boston, there was a service called Bridge that was much more about on-demand mobility. So you punched in your app where you were going to be, and the van would deviate from its route and come and pick you up. That service actually went bankrupt a couple of months ago, and there are other services like this that do variants of on-demand shared mobility with different kinds of vehicle types. This will be, I think, a common theme as we go through the next few years as this mobility revolution happens, is that there are going to be services that start and seem like great ideas, and they fail. And that's going to be in part how we learn what works and what doesn't. So right now, all of these services are being delivered in conventional vehicles being driven by human beings. There are now starting to be some of these shared services that are being trialed to be offered by automated vehicles. So Uber has been piloting a automated vehicle version of its service in Pittsburgh for about a year. A company called Nutonomy has been doing this in Singapore and in a part of Boston. And Google's autonomous vehicle wing, which is called Waymo, has just started signing up families in the Phoenix area for its automated ride-sharing service. Now, when we talk about automated vehicles, it's important to recognize that they're not all alike. Now, this is going to be impossible for any of you to read, and I apologize for this, but the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the Society for Automotive Engineers have come up with a scale that ranks autonomous vehicles by their level of autonomy. And it goes all the way from things that we probably didn't even process were autonomous features like cruise control down at level 1, up to Tesla's autopilot service, which enables people to hand over most but not all of the control to the vehicle in certain situations, which is, depending on how you count it, a level 2 or level 3, all the way up to the holy grail of level 5, which is autonomous vehicles that can go anywhere in the country and can drive themselves the entire way. Autonomous or automated vehicles also vary in other ways as well. When we talk about them and when you hear about them in the mass media, you often hear autonomous vehicles being called self-driving cars. But some of the most interesting and first applications of this technology are going to have nothing to do with cars. They're going to have to do with automation of long-distance trucking, which, if you think about it, is from the vantage point of the trucking companies, the overcoming some of the limitations of human drivers is potentially a very big deal for them. And also automated shuttle services like this one. There are a couple in the top right. There are a couple of these that exist now in Europe. There's a trial in California, maybe a couple of other cities. And basically what these automated shuttles are very similar to the kind of system that you have at Denver International Airport, where you have an automated train that takes you over a prescribed loop. And basically what these are shuttles that do roughly the same thing but without the tracks. So they go on at slow speeds along a prescribed route along a college campus or an office park or some very well-defined and separate area. And by eliminating the human driver, eliminating the need for the tracks, this creates some opportunities to provide these kinds of transportation connections in places where they otherwise might have been impossible. There are also advances in robot delivery services, and I have a slightly ridiculous video to show you on this score.
It all began in 2015 with a microchip and a massive idea. What if we could transform the way we delivered pizza to dramatically improve safety and efficiency while completely changing the game of the customer experience? What if we could harness the power of Domino's GPS tracking data and our artificial intelligence technology, then combine it with one of the world's most advanced robotic units? What if we could create the world's first autonomous pizza delivery vehicle? The seeds of the idea were developed at Domino's and incubated in our purpose-built innovation space, D-Lab. It was here that we started work on a Domino's robotic unit. Using a base unit sourced from the military and powered by technology from Australian startup company Marathon Robotics, we improvised, we explored, and we discovered that this audacious idea could actually become a reality. At the same time, we engaged the country's leading industrial design firm to design the look, feel and functionality of our latest recruit. The design had to be unlike anything ever seen before. From dozens of concepts, we selected one, and the Domino's robotic unit, or DRU for short, was born. After months of engineering, building and testing, the big day arrived. It was time for DRU to hit the streets.
All right, so the things about this video that I find fascinating are, first of all, that Domino's has a purpose-built innovation center. And secondly, that this is where all of our high technology has gotten to us, is to robot pizza delivery vehicles. Now, I would say that there's some element of this that when I first saw this video, I sort of wondered whether this was a spoof or an April Fool's thing. But there are actually, as of a couple of months ago, robot delivery vehicles that are being rolled out on the streets of San Francisco. And the San Francisco city government is now debating whether they should allow these things on public sidewalks. So, you know, these things are happening, and where they're not happening, they're coming very soon. So what makes this all really interesting is that all of these innovations, so shared mobility, autonomous vehicles, and we'll throw in electric vehicles, which are coming down in price and improving in capability every day, all of these things are happening at the same time. So they create opportunities for new combinations of services and for synergies that are really potentially very powerful and transformative. And already the lines between these different services that I just laid out for you over the last 10 or 15 minutes are beginning to blur. So when I went to rent a bike share vehicle earlier today, I found out that you could book it through your real-time transit information app, and that I could book it and pay for it right on that app. Those are two services that are coming together. You now have a car sharing service with General Motors' Maven car sharing service, which is now providing vehicles to Uber drivers to then provide ride sourcing with. You have autonomous vehicles that are being used in ride sourcing fleets. So you have all of these combinations and cross-pollinations that create, you know, almost an infinite number of variations of how these things can be combined to deliver services in a new way. And one place that some of this might lead is to something that is called mobility as a service. And this video is from a service that is actually up and running in Finland, and I believe one location in England as well.
The WIM app makes going places easier than ever. A monthly fee covers all your journeys with everything from buses, trains, taxis, brand new cars, bikes, and more. WIM takes away the hassle of traveling. It has it all: planning, routing, and tickets. You can create a monthly package to match your needs or just pay as you go. So how do you travel with WIM? It's simple. Enter your destination. And WIM combines the best transport options to take you door to door. It tells you when it's time to go and shows your moves on a map. The more you use WIM, the better it gets. It remembers your favorite places, syncs with your calendar, and plans your journeys in advance. Still, WIM is as spontaneous as you are. Fancy a film at the last minute? Grab a cab on a whim. All you need to do is press one button. Once the taxi arrives, just show your ticket and enjoy the ride. It even rewards you for making green choices. WIM frees you to move whenever and wherever you want, but it also makes your city a better place to live with less traffic jams and cleaner air.
All right. So, so here's why this is potentially revolutionary. So today, most of us rely on a single passenger car for a single personally owned car for most of our transportation. And when we choose which car to buy, we buy the car that is often the smallest that we can get that will handle our maximum need for it. So in my family, we choose the car based on the amount of space that we need to carry our camping supplies for the week that we spend every summer in Maine. For somebody else, it might be the size of car that you need to help be part of the soccer carpool on 12 or 13 Saturdays out of the year. And for the rest of the time that we have this car, we don't maximize our use of that space. And once we have the car in our driveway, we tend to use it because most of the costs of car ownership we pay for up front, and they don't vary with the number of miles we drive. Gasoline is probably one of the few things that really does and impinges on and affects our decisions. But when you're faced with the choice of getting into the car that's sitting in your driveway that you've already paid for, or walking a couple of blocks to get the bus that you have to pay $2 for and might not show up for 5 minutes, most folks are going to opt to drive the car. And from a societal point of view, this is all kind of nuts because our cars stay parked about 95% of the time. And when they're moving, they're usually about 70% empty. So a lot of the transportation problems that we talk about, whether it's the amount of space that's devoted for parking or congestion on our roads, are really problems that are exacerbated by the fact that we're moving a lot of empty space or storing a lot of empty space in our communities. If you move to a system in which you no longer need to own a personal car to meet all of your needs, where you can have access to a car for the soccer carpool when you need it, but you can use another form of vehicle when that makes sense, or have the incentive to ride or to ride your bike or take the bus or walk without that overhang of having the car in the driveway, suddenly people's transportation decisions begin to change. The incentives shift around. And so there are many folks who believe that this transformation to a shared mobility system in which you have access to an array of different services is something that can be really transformative. And there have been a number of studies that suggest this. So the International Transport Forum did a study where they modeled the entire transportation system of Lisbon, Portugal. And what they did was they basically asked a really simple question. What happens if we get rid of all the private cars and we replace them with a shared fleet of buses, vans, and taxis? And what they found was that the number of cars on the road would drop by 90%, congestion would disappear, the number of miles traveled would drop by more than a third, greenhouse gas emissions would fall by about a third without electrifying anything, and access to the transportation system throughout the city would be good, even in the most disconnected neighborhoods, even in the middle of the night. The longest that you would have to wait for a ride would be about 5 or 6 minutes. For most of the day and in most parts of the city, it would be about 2 or 3 minutes. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy came out with a report looking at the impacts of what they called the 3 revolutions in urban transportation, which is shared, autonomous, and electric. And they found that across the globe, the simultaneous adoption of those 3 revolutionary strategies would cut global energy consumption from passenger transportation by 70%, CO2 emissions from transportation by 80%, and save as much as $5 trillion a year. And your homegrown folks at the Rocky Mountain Institute had a report last year that found that if moving toward this world of shared and autonomous mobility could cause car ownership to peak as soon as 2020 and decline after that. So all of that sounds pretty amazing. You know, where do we sign up? But here's the challenge, and you might not be able to read this, but this sign says, "I've parked in this space since 2002. I'd like my space back if you don't mind. Thank you." And the challenge, though, is that the transformation from what we have now to this utopian future that is being described in these studies is not going to be smooth, and it is not going to be easy. And if we make the wrong policy decisions along the way, we could simply wind up with a turbocharged version of what it is that we have now. So folks in the field, and I was going to share a link to a great little 4 or 5 minute video about this, talk about heaven and hell scenarios of autonomous vehicles, with the hell scenario being that everybody owns their own. When they want to stop for coffee, they just leave it orbiting the block, and the number of miles traveled, CO2 emissions, and congestion all go through the roof, and it's a terrible future. And that all depends on the policies that we adopt to make sure that this transition works for us. Even if we do adopt those policies and the transition does work for us, the transition is going to be rocky. So that study that I referenced in Portugal actually found that you don't start to see a lot of societal benefits from this transition to a fully shared mobility system until about half the private vehicles are off the road. Before that, people have more choices, so it's good in a lot of different ways, but it doesn't necessarily deal with your congestion problem, your parking problem, or the CO2 and environmental sustainability issues until you get to a very large number of people who have made this transition. And so what that means is that as this is happening, if indeed it does happen, that people are going to go a long time and wonder where the transformative benefits are. They're not going to see a lot that really happens that benefits them on a societal level if that transition goes the way that they think that it might. And what's more, to facilitate that transition, you're going to need to reallocate some resources. So you're going to need to give somebody's favorite parking space in front of their business to a shared mobility vehicle so that it can pick people up and drop people off. You're going to need to reallocate funding from some forms of transportation to other forms of transportation. You're going to need to ask different things of people in your community. And all of that is going to feel very difficult, and it's going to feel very scary. And all of that is going to be happening at the same time that you're actually trying to solve all the transportation problems that you already have. And you don't want to have to wait 20 years to solve those problems. You want to be able to make progress on them now. And last but not least, nobody has actually been here before. So there aren't a lot of great models. In fact, there are no models of people and societies that have actually made this transition in the way that it's being described. A lot of the services that I've talked about in this presentation, in fact, almost all but 1 or 2 of them are less than a decade old. Most of them are less than 5 years old, and then a lot of them are less than 2 years old. And when we make transportation policy or policy in anything, we like to have evidence. We like to have data. We like to have peer-reviewed studies that show how different treatments work out so that we can be well-informed as we make policy decisions. None of that really exists in a systematic way with any of these services right now. And in fact, if you were going to go through that scenario of gathering lots of data and doing peer-reviewed studies, by the time that you got through with that process on the first wave of technological innovations, the second wave of technological innovations would already be washing over you. So it's a very challenging and very uncertain thing that we are all thinking about and trying to figure out how to adapt to. So in that kind of a situation with that kind of uncertainty, what do you do? Let me make a couple of suggestions to you. So the first suggestion is to try different approaches to apply these tools to demonstrated needs in your community. This is actually happening in a variety of places around the country in some pretty neat and not necessarily intuitive ways, and I'll talk to you about a couple of them. So the first is with relation to healthcare. My wife is a medical director at a neighborhood health center in the city of Boston, and one of the primary impediments to her patients obtaining care and to the health center running smoothly is transportation. A lot of her patients depend on public transportation. A lot of them depend on rides from relatives or friends. And it's very uncertain, and when folks don't show up or they show up late, it harms their care and it harms the ability of the health center to care for others. There are now some pilots happening around the country with Lyft and Uber and with other services where medical insurers and health providers are trying to use these services to provide non-emergency medical transportation to doctor's appointments. And if that can be done cost effectively, and it may be the case that it's not even necessarily the patient who is calling for the car, they may have the car sent from the doctor's office to come pick them up. If that can be done cost effectively and done well, that has the potential to really unlock some monetary savings and also better health for people in our communities. A second challenge that people are facing in a lot of cities is around urban development and affordable housing. So in most of our cities, we have requirements that people who build housing provide a certain amount of parking on site, or if you build a commercial facility, you provide a certain amount of parking on site. And that can drive up the cost of construction, and it also creates a situation in which people are driving to and from the place. And so that creates tensions with neighbors and others that tend to limit people's appetite for new development. In San Francisco, they have recently adopted a new ordinance that requires folks who build new residential and commercial buildings and provide parking to also provide access to a range of different alternatives to encourage people to use other ways to get around. And among those alternatives are some of the technologies and services that we've talked about here. So things like transit screens that show real-time transit information in the building lobby, as well as access to car sharing and bike sharing and other types of services. And so from the urban design and development point of view, you now have cities beginning to think, how can we begin to use access to these services to reduce the need for parking in our communities and unlock opportunities, perhaps for urban development, perhaps for using that space that we devote for parking to for other things that are important to our communities. And the last one is first and last mile access to public transportation. And there are several transit agencies around the country that are using partnerships with taxi services and with ride sourcing services to provide access to transit stops for people who live far enough away that that first and last mile connection to a transit link is very difficult. So there was just an announcement a couple of days ago that the Dayton, Ohio Transportation Authority is going to be providing subsidized rides for people who live in rural areas to be able to access the bus network. In Florida, the Pinellas Suncoast Transit Authority has been doing this now for about a year and a half, where they've been partnering with Lyft and Uber, not only to do first and last mile stuff, but also to provide access to transit for people when in the late night and overnight hours when the buses don't run anymore. And that's actually a really important thing because many low-income workers and service workers are not necessarily working 9-to-5 jobs. They're working jobs that maybe require them to work a night shift, maybe require them to get to work extremely early or leave extremely late. And so having access to a service that fills in for transit on at least one of those legs can enable folks who may really struggle to afford a personal car of their own to rely on the transit system for their other transportation needs. The second suggestion that I'd have for you, which goes back to the beginning of this presentation, is to have a clear idea of your goals and priorities of what you want Aspen to look like, what you want your transportation system to look like in the future, and to evaluate your adoption of these tools through this lens. And I know that that's really what a lot of this process is about, is having this kind of value-driven discussion. I want to caution you, though, about two things. So the first is about the need to be really clear and honest about the specific problems that you want to solve and what the barriers are to solving them. So if the issue is that you want to convince more people to share rides as they come up and down the valley, you need to understand what the barriers are to them sharing rides now, whether it's financial, whether it's in terms of scheduling, or whether it's cultural. Because the technologies themselves are not going to solve the problem. The technologies are a tool to enable you to provide services that meet people's needs in a different way, or to encourage people to undertake behaviors that they might otherwise not choose to do. So people might use a shiny new service once or twice just because it's novel, but they'll continue using it over time, and they'll change their transportation behaviors over time because it actually solves a problem and meets a need that they have and provides a better alternative. The second caution I'd give you is that it's important to understand and identify where values and priorities conflict. I had a boss once who said that if you have 3 priorities, you have no priorities. So there is usually one thing that you have to prioritize, and then you have the thing that you prioritize after that and the thing that you prioritize after that. And I say that because we would all love to have a transportation system that's cheap, fast, flexible, sustainable, comfortable in all weather, and supports our vision of how our communities can develop. That would be great. And I think that the judicious application of some of these tools over time open up new opportunities for us to check off more of those boxes. But there are inevitably going to be points at which some of those priorities conflict. And so being clear about where you rank them as a community and having an open and public discussion about how best to do that is going to be really important to making choices that serve the needs of everybody in the community and that can sustain themselves over time. So, to sum up, we all across the country, and you here in the Roaring Fork Valley, have a tremendous opportunity. It's an opportunity to solve vexing problems that you've been dealing with for decades, but also an opportunity to reimagine how this whole transportation system works in some new and very creative ways. I think that innovative mobility can be a big part of making that future real. I don't think it is inevitable that innovative mobility will make that future real. So I think the process that you all are engaged in here, the kinds of conversations that you're having as a community, are really important. They're vital. They're conversations that we should be happening all over the country because, frankly, we don't have a lot of time to figure this out. Autonomous vehicles are coming. If you listen to the automakers, they tell us that they're coming in the next 5 years, or at least in some way, shape, or form. We weren't in many of our communities prepared for when Lyft and Uber showed up on the scene. And so having the conversation, identifying your values, identifying what you want, and then setting public policies that encourage the kinds of services that you want and discourage the kinds of services that you don't want is going to be really key for making sense of this mobility revolution and making sure that it serves you. So thank you.
Microphone.
Did you show Tony this traffic jam this morning?
I did not, personally. Did you see the traffic jam?
I didn't
today?
see the traffic jam this morning, no. Tell me about it.
Yeah, so are there questions, specifically questions we can get underway? Cindy, I think you had your hand up first.
So, Bill, going back to Tony's premise of we have to know what our problem is, we all think we know what the problem is, but what's the problem? What are we trying to solve for? Are we trying to get more people on RAFTA because our problem's commuters? What are our problems?
Excellent question. That's probably a question more to us than it is to Tony. And honestly, that's kind of the center of our exercise. So we have certainly explored the full spectrum of possibilities, saying that this is basically a transportation and access and fairness, social equity issue. And on perhaps the other end of the spectrum, we define this as an environmental issue, where we know that the optics of Highway 82 and seeing cars backed up to the airport every day in high season and now to an increasing degree in low season does not comport well with how people see themselves and how they believe we should be how we should perform as a community, and whether your kind of reservation about that is either environmentally based or just reflective of kind of poor public transportation planning is up for debate. But Tony, the circumstance that we now face is that for probably an hour or so in the morning, we in transportation planning parlance, we operate at about service level F from our airport into town. We have busways. The busways were specifically designed to create a bias in favor of public transportation. People trying to access town in single occupancy vehicles are greatly disadvantaged, and there's certainly a lot of ways to talk about this. There's one point of view that would say that that the system is performing pretty much as anticipated, that if you just want to take a risk and drive a car at peak hours in and out of Aspen, you are going to pay the price in the form of congestion and slow travel. And I think a lot of the speakers we've talked to so far have said that almost anything we do is not, that strategies that are geared towards 100% congestion alleviation are not particularly workable strategies. So a certain amount of congestion is probably warranted, and so we're having the debate among ourselves as to what that is. Is it service level C? Is it simply a travel time? And we had one speaker talk to us about access into major central business districts and urban areas from outlying areas has not changed since Roman times, that basically there was an iron law that 30 minutes is the time that it takes to go from point A to point B in settled communities, and this is a constant no matter where you go. So pretty interesting. But the way, I think we in our exercise, and John, I'd like you to chip in on this, I think that we've simply tried to say, take the Aspen Area Community Plan, which said that we're going to try to draw a line in the sand and have no more than 23,000 trips a day on Highway 82. And I think we've tried to say, okay, that's a scarce, the ability to travel on Highway 82 is a scarce resource that should be carefully managed, and that's kind of what's driving our effort right now. But we're like every community. We have bus rapid transit, we have local bus service, and we have a lot of construction traffic. We have lots of private vehicle travel. But I guess the way we've defined it is it's all the above. It's an environmental problem, it's a carbon footprint problem, it's a greenhouse gas problem, it's a convenience problem, it's a big optical problem, and we can do better as a community. So that's kind of the way we're trying to get at it. And I hope these questions get directed to Tony, not to us.
So this is both observation, but also a question directly to Tony.
Sure.
So I work in downtown Basalt for CCY Architects, and I take RAFTA every day. I live up Valley, and I take RAFTA. And most of my coworkers live in Carbondale and Glenwood Springs. And it seems like those that live down valley have the hardest time getting on a RAFTA bus for convenience sake. Carbondale is much more suburban, and that last mile is much more difficult, especially in Carbondale. But furthermore, prices is the big deterrent. So since I live up valley, I'm in partially a free zone for some of the way, which helps subsidize the cost. So my question primarily is, how can we get businesses to buy into RAFTA, whether it's providing a subsidized bus pass, because a lot of folks in my office have voiced the desire that if they have a subsidized bus pass, if it's cheaper, they would jump on RAFTA. How can we involve businesses to encourage people that want to take public transit to do so?
Do you have the pre-tax benefit in your workplace?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
But even then, since the upfront cost has already been paid for, everyone has their own car, there's no incentive. Right.
Well, I think that's probably a question for you and your employer to lobby them to provide the subsidized transit pass. I think there's definitely evidence out there that when employers offer a range of transportation benefits, so particularly the pre-tax transit benefit, and for those of you who don't know what we're talking about, under federal law, in federal tax law, employers can offer a pre-tax transit benefit to their employees up to $255 a month, which essentially means that as an employee, you can take that money out of your salary tax-free. So if you took the money as salary, paid taxes on it, and then paid for your transit pass, you would be losing out relative to just getting that transit pass tax-free. That is an option that is available to a lot of folks, but it's not available in every workplace. And the fact that your workplace offers it is a really good sign. For a lot of workplaces, it actually makes financial sense for them to offer it because they save on taxes on their end as well. So there's a win-win. And if your workplace doesn't offer it, you should go ahead and talk to them. The other thing, and I would assume that you have something like this in Aspen, is at the municipal level, or maybe even at the county level. I'm not quite sure how things are organized here. There are a number of places that do transportation demand management ordinances where they require employers to offer certain benefits, or to provide for transportation options for their employees, usually when they're building a new facility. But in a few cities, the large cities of San Francisco, New York, and Washington, D.C., they actually now require many employers to offer at least the pre-tax transit benefit, if not subsidized. So there are some governmental ways to deal with this too. But I think that you're right in noting that employers and institutions have a big role to play in not only incentivizing people to use other forms of transportation in a variety of different ways, but also potentially to play a role in some of these innovative mobility solutions that we're talking about here. I think you may find in the future that offering a first or last mile connection to pay for that is a perk that employers give. It's a perk that stores offer to their patrons in lieu of parking. So I think you're right to identify that. And in terms of the specific tools, there are a variety of tools out there for employers to do it, but ultimately you've got to have the will.
Sorry. Do you see pools of employers pitching in within a chamber of commerce to make the bus passes more affordable and economical? So rather than the burden just on one company, can it be shared? Do you see cities doing this?
Yeah, I'm more familiar with what's happened in large cities, but in large cities and in fact in some office parks, there are organizations that are called transportation management agencies, or TMAs, that are essentially coalitions of businesses, and sometimes they receive government support and work directly with government, and sometimes they don't, that are all about finding ways to get employees to commute less by single occupancy vehicles. So they do a variety of different things. They, in some cases, subsidize transit passes. They run shuttle bus services of their own. They have fun events for Bike to Work Week. All of those things are things that are funded by the businesses in a particular area or a particular community, and they do it because they recognize that the traffic congestion is a quality of life problem, and it's a problem for their effectiveness as business organizations, because when people show up to work angry, frustrated, tired from a congested commute, they're less effective in doing what they do. And so there's, I think, really a case for, as you mentioned, businesses working together to make this happen, and there are a lot of examples around the country of places where they've done it.
Can do, what's your plan for the human element when you've got between 30 and 50 million people who drive for a living now all of a sudden not trained and hitting the open? You look at a trunk revolution, you got one. Mm-hmm. And that's the biggest issue I see with this. I like the congestion, and because I've been against this, this traffic congestion for years. I run airport shuttle here at the local airport. And so I'm looking at this, a lot of untrained people who drive for a living in trucks. There's 15 million there? Mm-hmm. Then you're looking at buses, and this is your biggest problem. And do they go to the streets and riot because they can't pay for their house? It better be thought out, and you better be thinking on that angle. It's your biggest obstacle I can see, because I think these vehicles will work. As a matter of fact, they probably drive a lot better than what I see on, I call it Daytona 500 coming up the Highway 82 because if you do 70, somebody's doing 80, and they're weaving through traffic as you come up, putting your life at danger. And if they can find 6 inches on each end of your car to jam themselves in front of your car, they'll do it. Mm-hmm. And I don't see the nirvana completely. I see a lot of angst. Yeah. And I see some good. It's quite amazing what I see, but it's kind of entertaining. Not everybody can be on welfare or some kind of government subsidy. Right. Look at 2 million coal miners out of work. That's what caused this last thing. Plus other people are out of work already, and they're not trained for over the 5 million. There's 5 million jobs not filled right now because they don't have the training. There's going to have to be a huge amount of that. So that's just my comment.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I think we could have spent another hour to an hour and a half talking about the social and political implications of what happens if all of this actually happens. But I think the jobs and economic issue is a huge potential overhang, and the first place where you might see that is in trucking. And so I agree with you. We've got to have a plan to figure out what to do when all of this happens. And I don't have that plan myself, but I know that we need to have one. We did a report with a coalition of groups in Massachusetts called Fast Forward, where we spent about 9 months talking with stakeholders, interviewing experts to try to suss out what are the social and economic and environmental implications of some of these technologies as they roll out. And the jobs issue was critical, but there are also a lot of places where there are impacts that aren't necessarily intuitive. So in a lot of cities, parking violation revenue and parking revenue is a pretty big source of municipal funds. And so if you move to a situation in which you have shared vehicles that don't have to park and that drive pretty well and that aren't going 80 miles an hour down the highway weaving in and out, all of those sources of revenue dry up. So what do we do then? So I think all of these things are things that we need to be thinking through in a fairly detailed way in our communities. And we could talk a lot more about them, but I do think that the jobs issue is something that is going to come to the fore very quickly if this transition happens the way that it looks like it might.
Tony, I've got a question for you. I was traveling in Europe 25, 30 years ago in a little town called Zermatt, Switzerland. And they did not allow fossil fuel vehicles in that community. It's much like Aspen. It's a box canyon, accessible by train only. Have there been any studies done on Zermatt and the effects of the transportation system that they implemented decades ago, and how that might impact a community like Aspen?
Yeah, there very well may have been. I'm not personally aware of them. I think on many of these issues, if you're looking for a progressive example of a place that does it, Switzerland is a good place to look. They actually have, they're not really true mobility as a service services, but they have for at least a couple of years, I think through the rail agency, provided a product that is a rail pass / access to car sharing / access to bike sharing product. And they were doing this, before a lot of other people even knew that that was a possibility. So there are definitely great examples in Europe. I would say that there are a number of cities right now that are moving toward banning fossil fuel vehicles. Oslo in Norway, the others escape me. But this is getting to be a live issue in cities that are much bigger than Aspen. I think that you have a couple of challenges that come into that right now. So, one of them is that if you're talking about access to by service workers or by other lower income folks who are not necessarily obtaining new vehicles in the next few years, you have a potential equity issue there. There may be ways to get around that, but that is certainly going to arise as a concern. And you have a lot of folks who are coming in from a lot of different places. So I would imagine, and I don't know if that town in Switzerland, if folks primarily arrive by air or by rail or by road, but here you have a lot of folks obviously who arrive by air, but also a lot of folks who arrive by road. So I agree with you that I think that is the way that as we move toward electric vehicles, you're going to be seeing more and more communities setting that as the standard. There's some implementational issues now that I think, again, you'd probably have to think through.
Tony, so at the beginning of the presentation, you talked about the kind of national values related to transportation, kind of in the post-war era, or pre. Have those changed? Have they evolved? What are they now? And, since we're kind of connected to a much larger system, obviously, do we need to be aware of those and kind of integrate them into our lens?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, my own take on federal transportation policy right now is that there are no values. There's, essentially we don't have, there have been attempts to articulate goals that I think are moving forward and are moving in the right direction. But until a couple of years ago, the idea that there was a goal for national transportation policy really wasn't articulated in any way that, you could explain to the public. We subsidize driving and we subsidize transit. We spend tax money on both of these things. There's a lot of money that flows out to no great and well-directed purpose. I would say that those values that I talked about are still held by a large number of people and many institutions as being the most important things, but you're starting to see some challenges to that. So in my neck of the woods in Boston, the challenge has been from a concept known as Vision Zero, which is something that began, I believe, in Sweden, but is carried over to the United States, where advocates push for cities to adopt a policy of working to eliminate deaths on the road to drivers, to pedestrians, to cyclists. And that articulation of values then flips a lot of things on its head, because it says that we will sacrifice speed for safety. We will make choices in the way that we use our streets and the way that we allocate our resources that prioritize safety above other things. So that conversation is starting to happen in a variety of cities around the country. I think there are a number of cities around the country that are putting climate change as a key prevention and mitigation of climate change as a key transportation goal. So I think that conversation is starting to change, but there are a lot of institutions that we have in this country that I think still espouse those values.
Sir.
Thank you for the video on the suburbs that you showed. Part of the reason the suburbs, I think, existed is the automobile made it easier to access. Mm-hmm. And an autonomous vehicle makes it even easier to access the suburbs or even further. And what do cities need to do to avoid sort of the exodus of people who now have the opportunity to live without worrying about a DUI, without commute time, because that's now can be work time. They can do that while they're working and not driving. And the reasons to live in the city are much more limited, and the reasons to live in the suburb, which were back then.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it's an important thing to keep in mind. I have a couple of reactions to it. So one reaction is that there is a counter argument, which is that autonomous vehicles create conditions to make cities better. So if you think about the things that people are annoyed by in cities, a lot of those things have at their root, whether it's congestion, whether it's pollution, whether it's noise, all of those things are things that are generated by cars, and especially fossil fuel fired cars. So there are a number of urbanists who actually think that this is, potentially transformative for cities, in that we can eliminate a lot of the parking that we currently have and find new ways to use our urban space in ways that make living in the city more pleasant. So that's point one. The second point is that I think public policy has a lot to do with it, and I think when you start talking about autonomous vehicles, the question of how you price travel on the roads becomes really critically important. Currently, one of the reasons that people live in the suburbs is because we really don't charge people for using the roads. We use the gas taxes to maintain them to some degree, but we subsidize that through general tax funding too. So any one individual trip is going to be very, very easy. So I think having a more robust conversation about how we price travel in this new era is going to be really important. And then the last thing I would just say is that I'm a little skeptical of the notion that autonomous vehicles are going to be places where people are going to want to work and spend a lot of quality time. I can't read a book or look at a computer while I'm in a car. Even if I'm in the passenger seat, I immediately get car sick. And there's a large chunk of the population that is not unlike me in that respect. And it's one of the reasons that I can work on a train, but I have a really hard time working on a bus. And it's just that the motion is different, and it affects people in a different way. So whether that travel experience in an autonomous vehicle is going to be the kind of experience that you want to spend a lot more time with, I think for some people it very well may be, but I think that it's a little bit more of an open question maybe than people generally assume.
Tony, on behalf of our group, I would like to frame a question for you.
Sure.
And it goes back maybe to Cindy's original question. In trying to examine the problem, I think we've looked for what might constitute low-hanging fruit, or things that might constitute relatively easily implemented and efficient things. So what we know is, you saw the national average of 1.6 people per car. That's in daily commuting. It's lower here. We think it's like 1.2 or something like that. It's embarrassingly low. So again, we have over 20,000 vehicle trips on Highway 82 every day. We've had discussions about if we were successful in going from 1.2 to 2.1 or 2.0. The question, I guess, is, do you know of communities, or we've looked at the idea of trying to do an enhanced platform-based rideshare program with ride-sharing, smartphone-based systems. Are there models that we could look at? Are there examples out there of communities that have been successful in increasing more efficient use of private vehicular travel?
I'm having a hard time thinking of them off the top of my head. I'm sorry to disappoint.
Yeah.
Particularly with these tools that we're talking about here, they're a lot of those decisions, I think, are driven by economics and convenience of whether you will share or whether you won't share on a particular ride. And the places where you have a lot of casual ride sharing in places like San Francisco and in Washington, D.C. are outside of toll bridges. And there's a custom called slugging, where people will show up, they will park right outside the toll bridge, and another person will come and pick them up. Strangers, I mean, hitchhiking essentially.
Right.
People will come and pick them up, and they'll take them over the toll bridge, and they'll split the cost of the toll, and then they'll leave them off at the other end, and they'll take transit or do whatever they need to do to go the last mile. And so we know that when there's a financial incentive for people to do it, that they'll do it. I don't think that means that it can't be done without that kind of an incentive. There are some interesting models that are currently being experimented with for rural ride sharing. There are these services that we talked about here that are, trying to find new ways to get people to carpool together by just making it easier to find a match. I think all of those have some amount of promise, but I don't think that there's a community out there that I'm aware of in the US that has successfully used those tools to really bump up carpooling. Carpooling has actually been falling now since the 70s. It used to be in the 70s that about 20% of people nationwide carpooled, and now it's down around 9%. And I think that these technological tools give you the opportunity to stem some of that bleeding and hopefully to get folks to share rides more. But the economics of it are going to come into play, and we'll just have to keep experimenting with models and try a lot of things and see what might work.
Maybe we'll be the first.
I hope that doesn't end our conversation on a downer.
No. One last question. We're at 7, and we promised to let everyone go at 7 o'clock with our last question. I would like to see if anyone else might have a question. Michael.
A previous speaker talked about housing as a potential transportation solution, and our situation here, most people are commuting to Aspen. We have other population centers down valley. All of them are sort of made queasy by the potential of more population density. Small town character is kind of a phrase that rules the day. For this future of transportation, would it be beneficial to have population density focused in areas like these down valley towns? Would that make it easier for some of these future systems to engage people and get them to move rather than from the suburbs to density, from density point to density point?
Mm-hmm. Density makes a lot of these systems work a lot better. If you think about how you can match people, you're much more likely to be able to match people for rides or share vehicles or share other things if you have people who are in close proximity. So if you have a lot of folks who are going from point A to point B at the same time, they can share rides. If you have a lot of folks who are living in a particular area, they can obtain transportation, access to shared vehicles that way. So I think that the answer to that question is if you do the land use in such a way that it makes sharing easier and more possible, it will be a larger part of the conversation sooner rather than later. I'm not sure whether that was the question that you were asking, or you were asking the flip side of the question, which is, do these shared services lead to changes in land use?
It was more the question that you just answered, but I would love to hear the answer to the question.
I think the answer to that is, in theory, but land use regulation is really all about zoning and planning, and that's a societally determined thing, especially in a place where you might have a lot of demand for housing that is not necessarily being satisfied. I mean, those are decisions that communities are going to make as to how they're going to house their people and what kind of construction they're going to allow. But I think that the notion that if you can, these services create opportunities for you to create density that is potentially a little bit friendlier in its reduced reliance on single passenger cars. And you have to think it through carefully, you have to create the right set of incentives, but it does open up that possibility of creating ways to house people in slightly more compact ways that may still ruffle feathers, but might ruffle a few fewer feathers than they would otherwise.
I think that brings us to a point where we'd like to thank the Aspen Institute for their generosity in providing the room this evening, and I think we would all agree an excellent presentation from Tony Dutzik. So with that, we want to thank everyone for coming. Stay tuned, we're working hard on this, and John Bennett assures us we'll be finished by June. So thanks everybody for coming, and thanks Tony for the presentation.
Thank you.